Yeah, the idea really for me in terms of being a subversive teacher is the subversiveness comes from just trying to let children learn without knowing that they're learning. That's the kind of key. And so subversive is maybe the wrong word, or it's one that I use a lot, but just this idea that learning should happen naturally, and when you've got really high levels of engagement, that's when you get progress and attainment. That's when you get children with high levels of well-being. And so it's letting children learn all they need to know without thinking that they're learning. They can learn as well through a lot of child-led learning, so the idea that you are using children's interests, we're talking early years a lot about the unique child and the journey of the unique child. And it's about ensuring that what we provide is as unique as we can make it. And the more that you can dress and base your teaching and learning experiences around children's interests, then the more unique that journey becomes. I think as a young teacher, pre-children of my own, I thought I was doing quite a unique experience for my children, although we're talking early 90s, so it was very topic-based, it wasn't that unique. But then I went on to have my own children, 3 of them fairly close together, which was both careless and unnecessary, and 3 boys as well, which was just bad luck, really. But when they went off to school, even though I'd been in education for a long time then, and when my eldest was born, I was then a head teacher, I just wanted them to go to somewhere that would cherish the wonder that they were, the uniqueness of my children. And that really made me think differently about what I wanted for my own little children, and then as an educator, how I could try and provide that for everybody's children, because of course every parent feels the same way about their own children. And so the idea of trying to create a more play-based curriculum was partly linked to children's learning styles, the fact that we know how children learn when they're in the early years, and it's not the same way that they do because their brain development is different from when they're older, but also just trying to make it unique so that you really respected the individuality of children and tried to bring that in. And so gradually over a period of time for me as an educator and as a kind of head teacher then, we did less and less of the kind of very formulaic, as we'd always done, activity topic-based approach, and moved far more to skills and experiences and interactions where you can say, this is what we want you to experience, but how you experience it can be different depending on what you're interested in. So I was talking yesterday to a group of practitioners in an academy chain about creativity in the early years, and talking about kind of pre-COVID, I'd worked with some early years children where the adult had spent a long time whittling a tulip out of a potato, so for some potato printing. And they were beautifully whittled potatoes and they were beautiful tulips. And the adult basically said to the children, this afternoon, with like great excitement, you could print a print of tulip with one of the potatoes that Mrs. Smith has whittled. And everybody was like that, woo! But nobody went to print a tulip with a potato. And our kind of discussion was around, well, if we'd said this afternoon you could experiment with printing, you could print with potatoes, you can print with scrubbing brushes, you can print with dinosaurs' feet, you could print with cars, you could go out in the outdoor area and you could print with the tyres of a bike. They're still experiencing printing. But and then you got genuine excitement of, I could go and get on the bike and paint the tyres, and that's really, whereas if somebody says, would you like to come and paint a tulip with a whittled potato? You're like, no, you're all right, thanks very much. So this idea of trying to step away from, nobody will die if they print with a whittled potato, but the idea that you can take a concept like printing and you can introduce it to children and get them to engage with it by taking it in a direction that's going to really invigorate them and interest them. And so I've very much been born and brought up in there. We're all going to make a daffodil out of an egg box. We're all going to make a jellyfish out of a paper plate. We're all going to make a tulip out of a whittled potato. And you can't underestimate the whittling skills. They were quite amazing. But now I'd like you all to experience this and hear a range of ways in which you can experience it. And you get much higher levels of engagement, much higher levels of buy-in. And that's what then leads you to the opportunities for attainment, progress, adult intervention, all that kind of stuff. The joy of baby watching for me was when I came to the baby watching session that you led, and it was adults, not children, who were observing. And it was just, I mean, it was like regression, because the adults were just like the children in terms of, oh, what do that mean? Well, that's interesting. And obviously when you've had your own children as well, you look at it in a slightly different way, or lots of experience with babies. But I think it's about the level of engagement is important. And what's great about the baby watching experience is that you're both in it and outside of it. That's when a good facilitator is really important, because it's not that the children are passing around the baby for a poke. It's that the children are having an opportunity to observe. And sometimes when we're talking about things like carpet behaviours, there are lots of discussions around carpet behaviours and how some children really struggle to regulate their behaviour on the carpet. When they've got something interesting, there is never an issue with behaviour regulation. Well, there are interesting elements to it. So partly, with the baby watching experience, there is usually captivation, because you are mesmerised by this it's kind of this macro movements that's happening. You're really tuned into observing. You'll be listening really carefully for those things like the murmurings and the gurglings and the feeding sounds and all that sort of stuff. You're listening to what the parent is saying to the child, and if they're getting any kind of response at all, and the physicality of a baby, and the fact that it's all quite a small space to observe, that also makes it all really tangible. So I think what it offers loads of opportunities for children to be still. And often in an early years environment, unless you're sitting on the carpet or having a story, there are not a lot of opportunity to be still. Sometimes during snack, you might be a bit. But the problem with on the carpet is, I was talking about this again the other day, that when children are learning, they make conscious cognitive links and subconscious cognitive links. And the conscious cognitive links are basically exchange of knowledge, taking in information, what you'd need to learn, that kind of thing. But the subconscious cognitive link is more important than the conscious one, because it's how we feel as a learner, and it's about atmosphere within space. And often, we're not trained as teachers to think about atmosphere in the same way that we are to think about phonics progression and maths progression. But I was reading some really interesting stuff that I'm doing for some work I'm doing for university, and it was adults recounting their experience of carpet sessions in reception. So this particular person was saying that she was a very well-behaved girl at 4, and so she was sat between two that were labelled as naughty boys. And she was sat between the two naughty boys because she was very well behaved and they needed to be split up. But she said her entire time on the carpet was for her periods of really high anxiety, because she was really worried that these naughty boys were going to get her into trouble, and they kept leaning over her to talk to each other. And she said she can remember, now she's in her 50s, but she can remember being 4 and being really worried the teacher was going to think it was her that was messing about. So she said when they gathered on the carpet, the minute the teacher said, "Right, everybody come to the carpet," her stomach used to go, because she was sitting next to this boy. So when we think about things like atmosphere and that kind of subconscious links that we make, giving children opportunities to do things like observation of babies and baby watching, that gives a really positive subconscious link between a space and something that's occurring within the space. That's fascinating. And it is fascinating. Like when we're watching Lambing Live with early years children, and they're fascinated by that process. But seeing little versions of themselves, or if they've got brothers and sisters and they can say, "Oh, my brother and sister does that," or if they haven't got any siblings, so they don't have that opportunity to share that knowledge of what a baby is and what a baby does, it is just really fascinating for them. So besides the obvious element of they're watching something else and they're having lots of opportunities for language exchange and thinking, there are all sorts of other really subtle things that are going on in terms of their internal kind of well-being, and also their internal subconscious cognitive links that can be really positive for. And also for those children, and there are lots of them that don't get that same emotional connection with their own parent, or they haven't got that attachment. It's really interesting for them to observe that and then reflect on it. That, an opportunity is in an appropriate way to talk to very young children about what those what that language means, what that cueing means when the parent is doing what the parent is doing. Why? How do you think the parent feels? How do you think the child feels? Really useful way of exploring feelings then within that. And of course, then in settings that provide lots of doll play, which is really good practice anyway, in conjunction with something like baby watching, it takes your doll play onto a significantly different level, because you're not just doing, you've got the baby, it becomes a much deeper experience because they start to replicate the things that they've observed in the baby watching sessions. So you're beginning to revisit and reinforce some of those feelings and those interactions. So, on a very surface level, it's just fascinating and it's a lovely experience for children to have. But there are so many things that run much, much deeper into it that are linked both to the kind of psychology of developing children and also their knowledge base around what it is to, look after and care for a baby and what it is to closely observe another human being who's at a different stage of development to them. And of course, they're not only observing the baby, they're also observing the parent. And that's interesting in terms of how they are parented. And everybody's got a story. And that's when all the interesting stories come out where they say, my mummy says this and my daddy says this. You're like, oh, really? That's interesting. But there are so many layers to it. And it's on the one hand, such a simple concept in its very simplicity that you bring in a baby and you observe that baby. And that is probably the simplest definition of it. But actually, it's way more complex. It is. It is. And again, especially for all age groups, really. And I know it has run in studies all the way through, into generational work, where it brings a whole other raft of things for people who are kind of in the twilight years and remembering they're having the babies. But I think in terms of early years particularly, there are so many things that you can do with it that would fit into the areas of learning, and you don't want to make it. I mean, you could talk about weighing the baby and measuring the baby, and I think in terms of what it is in its purest sense, that almost would spoil the experience, because it's not about maths and it's about the fact that we are observing, and it is that observation. And also for young children, the opportunity to have, we were talking earlier years about sustained shared talking and sustained shared thinking. So the idea of sustained shared talking being a group of children, can be two or more, that engage in a prolonged discussion about a particular subject and talk around it and over it and under it and through it. So with a really well-positioned facilitating adult, you get some really good sustained shared talk about what I've seen. But then the thought that goes under that around what do you think, why do you think the baby's doing that? Why do you think the mummy's doing that? What do you think's happening there? That thinking was really helped to develop their thinking skills. We want creative and critical thinkers. Creative thinkers are children who've been given opportunity to think about lots of diverse things in diverse ways. So they're not just thinking about, does 1 and 1 make 2, or am I hungry, what am I going to eat? It's opportunities to think about things outside of the everyday routine. Now, for some of them, even if you've got a brother or a sister, when you're in the family dynamic and it's all going on and you're breastfeeding, you're cooking the tea and you're doing the washing, that's very different to sitting and observing a parent with a child. So yes, you've got experience, but you see it in a very different way. My sister-in-law had 4 children fairly close together. And I remember her third one going round when the third one was just born, and the second child came in with all the parents were there, but obviously pre-COVID, you're passing the baby around, and she came in with her doll by the leg upside down, and she lifted up her vest and she clamped her doll on, and she sat down on the floor just with a bare chest, and this doll clamped onto her boob. And you could see there were various adults in the room who were just a bit like, oh, what's going on here? And then she finished, she put it over her shoulder, banged its back way too hard, picked it up by the leg and carried it out again. And I just remember thinking at the time, it was so natural, it was so part of her play, and she just came in, she did it, and then she went off again. She didn't say anything, nobody said anything to her, but it was lovely that was very much part of her lived experience, and that would stay with her. So, things like that will come out in other sessions of baby watching later on, because obviously they've had that experience. So yeah, it's multi-layered, and I think it's up to the adults what they do with that. But I also think the more you do it as an adult, as a facilitator, the more intuitive you become and the richer the experience becomes, because you know the kinds of questions that are going to get those kinds of responses, and you can take those questions a little bit further.
It's really made a difference between the relationships between the person delivering, which is usually the teacher, it can be a TA or a family support worker. It's made a massive difference to the relationship between them and the children, because they're seen and heard in a different way. Mm. And it really speeds up a sort of connection between the teacher and their children.
And we also know what we talked ages ago about the fact that it becomes like the collective class or group baby, and they see it with some ownership as a group, and that's nice. So it's not their baby, and it's not like having a goldfish that you call Bob, but the fact that you've got this baby that, and then, you know, I know you've talked about the fact that when parents don't come in because the baby's poorly, there's genuine concerns around the children, and they make cards and all sorts of things because they invest in this little being that's coming into that space. And again, for those that haven't got siblings or those relationships, even if they have got siblings, that's really important. So all of these things that are very subtle are really, really significant.
Yeah. And we also have boys react just as positively as girls. And I think that's really, really interesting. I have boys making incredibly wise and considered comments. I mean, the children blow me away with their sensitivity. And they act as great models for other children that are listening to them. It nurtures the empathy in a collective way. And that's very true. Relationships do improve, and therefore, because they begin to think about each other and think, what would it be like for the other person? They're not as aggressive in play. They're more cooperative. It is just fascinating what children gain from just being part of this for about 10 to 20 minutes a week.
Yeah, and I think for very young children, when they're developing that sense of empathy, and it is really difficult to be empathetic. It's not something you're born with. And so when you've got 2-year-olds where you're saying, Chloe's crying because you've got all of the toys, and why don't we just give one to Chloe? And they're like, no, because I don't want to give one to Chloe because they're my toys. Why would I give one to Chloe? I want them all. And to develop that takes time and it takes experience. And so it doesn't happen overnight, but the more opportunities they have to do that and the more reference points they have. And you're dead right, the fact that they get that shared experience and a time to reflect in the way that a 2 or 3-year-old can reflect. And what's amazed me, 31 years I've been in early years now, but how wise children can be. Lots of people assume because you're 3 or 4, you're just 3 or 4, but actually there are nuggets that come out of their mouth, especially around, because they're very honest about their feelings a lot of the time, and they will say, you have made me feel sad, you have made me feel cross, I don't want to do that, in a way that older children or adults, they mask that. So that really obvious expression of feeling can work really well for adults to be able to say, right, you feel like that. Why do you feel like that? Because the other hard thing is articulating how you feel. Again, I'm doing some work around how behaviour is not the child, and that behaviour is usually a way of children trying to articulate something that they can't, for whatever reason, articulate. They haven't got the vocabulary, or they just don't know why they feel like that. And we need to separate behaviours from children, because otherwise you end up labelling children like the naughty boy. But for them to have an experience of observing and other children articulating feelings, or even being asked questions that make them reflect and explore on their own feelings, or give them the language to express, all of that is really useful. And also for the adult, you've got a reference point. So again, you can say, if there is some quite robust play going on, or some conflict, you need some conflict resolution around, it's good to let children experiment with that. But you can then bring in, now, when we were watching so-and-so and so-and-so, and that happened, what did we talk about then? How did that feel? What do we think that might have been? And you're bringing lovely reference points in that children can relate to. Because if you haven't got a reference point and you're 3 or 4 or 5, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you have, it does make a lot.
You're so right. That we've had several children who've never spoken speak for the first time in baby watching. One of those was a child with English as a second language, year 2, and the teacher was so excited. She said, "Did you see so-and-so?" And I said, "I didn't really," because she was just part of the class. And she said that was the first time she'd spoken in school, because she was so desperate to contribute to what the baby was doing. And once she spoke, and it gave her the confidence to speak, she then was asking for help. She was asking for a coat to be done up. She was making friends in the playground. And it gave her the permission giving of that space with the mother and baby, gave her absolute confidence. And one of the other favourite stories I have is that the naming of the feelings. I think unless we have a context that's been reflected and named for us, how can we know what this confusing place is inside?
Yes.
What's wonderful is that you get to learn about all the feelings, not just the nice, happy ones. So one of my favourite stories was a child who, as you said, was acting out because they didn't have the words. And he was a year 3, and he was being asked about how he felt about baby watching. And he was all curled up. And he said, "Well, I used to growl at everybody." He didn't know anything else, just growling. And then he then unfurled. He said, "But now I can use words," because he had a context. He was able to think, "Oh, that's frustration. That is, I feel that. That's what it's called." And then, as you say, the teacher can continue that. "Oh, I noticed that you're a little bit frustrated with your work. Do you remember in baby watching when we saw the baby frustrated?" So it's this wonderful way of improving their emotional language, helping them self-understand. And
you're saying that when the baby's frustrated, all it can do is cry because babies can't talk yet and they can't process his emotions. When we feel that same feeling, which is exactly the same feeling, here are some of the strategies we can use that help us to get past that, over that, through that. I think you're right as well with English as an additional language, or English as a second language. It's a shared experience, so you don't need words to partake in the experience, because the observation and what you feel and what you think when you're watching it, even if you don't understand the language, is still captivating. Whereas if you're sitting in a phonics session, for example, and you can't understand anything that's going on and you're not captivated by what's happening in the space, you will disengage from that. But also, there are really clear points of reference. So you're talking about baby, you're talking about mummy or daddy, you're talking about... So there are key bits of vocabulary that are naming words that are being repetitively used while you're being captivated by this space. So you can see how you're not in a session where you're doing some kind of language intervention. You're not in a large group teaching situation. You can be carried away by the moment, and that does give you the permission to forget yourself and actually try it out and speak and do it. And you're right, once that's happened and it works, you often see children make very quick progress thereafter, because they suddenly think, right, I get this now, I can see how this works.
Yeah.
But it is that opportunity to share. If we come back to like atmosphere, I'm doing a piece of writing at the moment, and it's about enchantment in the early years, and it's about the concept of enchantment. And the enchantment can be good or can be bad. The idea of being truly enchanted is when you are taken outside of your own being momentarily or for a longer period of time because you are so invested in what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So really effective learning for children can come when they have moments of enchantment. And so in an early years space, what I'm really looking at is, are there lots of opportunities for children to come across happenings, resources, interactions that are so engaging that they actually forget themselves. There's also a thing called flow theory, which talks about the fact that when you are in flow, that you have no concept of time because you're so invested in what you're doing. And actually it relates to education, but also gamers who are playing whatever computer games often describe losing hours of time because they're so invested in the game. So the idea of something like baby watching is creating potential for moments of enchantment, because it is so engaging and it's live and it's real. The children get taken out of themselves and then they plop back in. But it's in that time of being out where real transformational stuff happens in your brain, and then you come back. So the more moments of enchantment we can create in a space, and certainly there's nothing more enchanting than watching the interaction between a parent and a child, but even for very little children, it can be quite transformative, especially if you're doing it over time. Thanks. And it's self-regulation, and it's that early venture into permissions and permission given and all those kind of quite complex but really important things that children need to understand, the more we can find gentle roots into those, then the better that is, because then they build up a gradual understanding of what given permission might be, as opposed to trying to realise what that concept is as a formed concept further down the line. And when you're talking about the baby and permission to, and why we have to sit in our hands, and why might we and why might we not, and even the baby can't tell you that whether they like it or not, but the mummy or the daddy understands their baby and what the baby's feeling. But it's really important that we don't do that, because it might make the baby feel uncomfortable. It's the same as why it's really important that we don't do this, because it might make you feel uncomfortable. And that's nice ways into what can be quite difficult conversations to have with children.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, plethora of things that it can open up to. I think it's the more you can get that peer tutoring in, the shared experience. And again, children often will take more from their peers, because it's a different dynamic in terms of the relationship between the adult and the child, which can be sometimes quite binary. And adults see themselves in the role of the protector, the educator, and the child is the child and the learner. Whereas child to child, they are equals in lots of ways. And so therefore, when they are sharing information, it is shared in a different way. It's fascinating, the kind of psychology of how we process information, even as adults, and the psychology of how we process information is given to us by different people. And that even bizarrely now, the things like if it's said by a man, it usually carries more gravitas than it's said by a woman. If it's said by somebody in a white coat, it will carry more gravitas than it's said by somebody in a sweatshirt who hasn't washed their hair. And actually the information can be rubbish, but it's that subconscious societal links that we make to markers of, well, that must mean that and that must mean that. But for children, it's no different. And I think they very much, most of them, respect the parent or teacher or adult child, and they see that as very different. So peer tutoring can be a fantastic way of getting that kind of knowledge across.
Yeah.
And I think you're dead right in that it's not, I think what can be hard is when you're used to be in a teaching role, and then you go to facilitate within a baby watching session, you have to sometimes bite your lip and sit in your hands, because it's trying to get out of like teacher Tourette's, where you constantly want to say, oh, what's that about? And I wonder about that. And how do you do that? And how many fingers can you see? And how many does that? It's got winding that back in and thinking, right, this is a completely different focus, where we're now really looking at enabling the children, giving them the kind of, it's like when you're fishing, you kind of chuck in your worm to give them the opportunity to engage, and then trying to take that forward without leading it. And that's a real skill. And you have to kind of learn to let them lead while you facilitate, because if you start to lead, then you might be taking them down a path that they don't necessarily want to go on. So challenging but fascinating. And when done well, I mean, we saw you do it, you did it expertly well. You could just see how many avenues there were for exploration. But I found myself thinking, I probably would have said that then, or I probably would have said to the mum, could you just show us that again, or could you just lift that up, really? And what you've got to do is leave them. It's almost like they're on an episode of The Cube, and they're in the cube, and you're outside of the cube, invisible cube, and you're watching and articulating what you see. But that's the beauty of it. If you start to intervene too much, you break the spell, and I think that's where a lot of the magic happens.
It's not prescriptive. It's as attuned to the children as it is that the mother and the baby are attuned to one another, because it's so relational.
It is.
And values-based education often used because it sort of encompasses so many values like respect, listening.
Attuned is a really good word, and it's attuning yourself to the space and to the moment and to just what you can see, and allowing children to just have that moment and absorb it as well as engage with everybody else. And I think also the really positive thing about it is it doesn't matter who you are or what your lived experience has been. You are in a moment watching two human beings interact. So therefore, you don't have to have a particular skill set or have had a particular prior experience. It's just a moment that anybody can observe, because you're observing basic human nature and human interaction. So it's quite a good level that you don't have had experience of to. So, that's again a nice playing field for everybody and every child that we're able to come to that. But yeah, I'd go with amazing, brilliantly creative. That's great.
We believe in curiosity.
Absolutely.
And we think baby watching really helps children discover and be curious. And there's enchantment there, isn't there?
Absolutely. Long may that continue in all aspects of education.
And all through our lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Alistair. It's been fantastic you joined us.
No problem.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks.